Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Word Balloon, the comic book conversation show. John Sutras here for your weekend and possibly into next week enjoyment. I'm so happy to welcome Dave Gibbons back to Word Balloon, one of the great creators, one of the men of the 80s British invasion, and we talk about his early days of coming over here and having adventures in the DC offices and meeting some of the classic DC creatives, from working with Len Wein on Green Lantern to being edited by Julie Schwartz. Of course, we talk about Watchmen. Of course, we talk about the great Superman annual, The Man Who Has Everything, because there was some really interesting, obviously, design work happening in those books, and it's always great to re-examine those. I'm always glad that Dave is willing to talk about Watchmen. I don't want him to think that's the only reason why I have him on, and in fact, I think this conversation proves it, because we go into a bunch of different directions, from British culture and a little bit of British sports to just some really fun ideas and thoughts about the comic book business. Dave is keeping himself busy. He is working on new video games and also some new ideas for comics and adaptations of his previous work. I always want to know what's happening with the originals. His excellent Vertigo series about the British mod scene. Not mob, mod. The scooters and kind of the tough gangs of the late 50s and early 60s. And Dave, kind of considers that period a bit autobiographical, which I always find fascinating. I think it would make a great streaming series. Of course, we talk about the Watchmen HBO series and just his thoughts on streaming in general and that avenue. But, he's also working on a really neat project that we talk about at the end of the conversation, and I'll let you hear about it from Dave's words himself. But just a nice, relaxing 90 minutes with the great Dave Gibbons on today's Word Balloon. All brought to you by the League of Word Balloon listeners. Thank you greatly, League, for your support. February is wrapping up. We've got a few new League members. I thank you very much. I hope you picked up your cape and domino mask at the cave entrance. And I really appreciate you joining me and helping me by sponsoring Word Balloon through your subscriptions. Word Balloon's free, but if you like what you hear here and you want to help out the cause, you can go to patreon.com/wordballoon or the front page of wordballoon.com and click on the Patreon ad. That will take you to my Patreon page. And as always, your support means a lot, and it keeps the lights on, and it allows me to go to conventions and network with people and get to know people like Dave Gibbons himself. As it happened through the years. Man, 2009, I think, was the first time I met him at San Diego Comic-Con. Maybe 2008. I can't remember. But it was so great. And, that's when we met face-to-face. And, it's great that he comes back, and all of them do. So I thank you for your support. You make this show possible. Thank you greatly, League of Word Balloon listeners. Word Balloon is also brought to you by Aftershock Comics. They've got a lot of great new titles right now. Have you checked out John Layman's The Man Who Effed Up Time this month? More great books coming, like in March, it'll be Stephanie Phillips' new Aftershock book, Artemis and the Assassins, a great pulp adventure that I'm looking forward to speaking to her about. There's also Zach Thompson's Undone by Blood and God Killers from Mark Sable. They'll be going along with other Aftershock favorites like Animosity from Marguerite Bennett and Raphael De La Tour, and Baby Teeth with Donnie Cates and Gary Brown, A Walk Through Hell from Garth Ennis and Gordon Suzuka. There's also great things like Jimmy's Bastards from Garth Ennis and Dark Red from Tim Seeley, Dark Ark from Cullen Bunn and Juan Doe. Paul Jenkins has so many great Aftershock titles. My buddy Phil Hester is there with Stronghold. So many great titles that deserve your attention. Go to their website. You'll find full story descriptions, preview pages, and how to get these books digitally or using the diamond codes to order them through your local shop at AftershockComics.com. Okay, like some Word Balloon episodes, sometimes we just start in conversation and I hear some interesting tidbits that I want to include in the interview. So I end up saying, hey, do you mind if we keep that in? And most of the time they say, yeah, that's fine. It's cool. So you're going to hear a bit about some ideas that Dave has been thinking about, and also how his Skype connection and also internet connection in general has improved with new technology. So it's kind of a lazy first couple minutes, and then we finally get into the intro and the full conversation. Dave Gibbons on today's Word Balloon. I figure you do a lot of these, if not even interviews. You're probably doing a lot of Skyping and things.
Well, we used to have a really bad internet connection around here to the extent that I had to have a satellite dish.
Jeez.
And even with that, it was very temperamental and it would break and so on. But about 6 months ago, we got super fast broadband, 300 meg plus, which means that Skype, Slack, everything, Hangouts, all just works really seamlessly now with no lag, no. I mean, having said that, of course, what's going to happen is we're going to get to the interesting bit in this and the connection's going to drop. But and of course it also means we can watch streaming TV, which before was always a little bit of a gamble whether you could actually relax with Netflix or actually sit there on tenterhooks waiting for it to stop.
I understand. Jeez, I know Colleen Doran, living in the Smoky Mountains, always had internet trouble and everything. So. Yeah.
I mean, the satellite solution is reasonable. It's quite expensive, and you don't get huge speeds. But I think that's what you fall back on if you haven't got a cable connection. But I mean, we do live in a very nice part of the country, in maybe the British equivalent of where Colleen lives.
Okay.
So you can't really grumble too much. Perhaps it's the price you pay for paradise. How about that?
I'm hip. I understand. That's what are you going to do? I understand. That's so funny. Jeez. Well, and as you said, the funny thing is, and it happened. Oh God. About a year ago, I was talking to Alex Ross, had a great intense conversation with him, and it didn't record. And I'm just like, oh no.
Oh God. Well, I actually got a message when I just launched Skype that apparently my version of Call Recorder doesn't work. So I hope you can do it all from your end.
Oh yeah. No. Everything's running fine. I checked everything, beforehand, and everything's recording properly. So no, we're good. And my only problem sometimes is when somebody calls me instead of me calling out,
right.
then it only records my side of the story, and it doesn't do the caller. So
yeah. I mean, you must know much more about this than me, but my son actually does a podcast. He does a gaming podcast with a couple of his friends. It's called Big Red Barrel UK, if you want to check it out.
I would check it out. That's interesting.
And they've got it figured. So what they do is I think they have the Skype connection, but then they also record their individual input into it.
Yes.
And at the beginning of it, they do like a hand clap. Sorry, I hope that hasn't blown your speakers.
No, you're cool.
But they do like a hand clap, and then they sync it back in. And they find, particularly because it's a discussion type podcast, that if somebody dries up or says something they don't want to be in there, or yawns or sneezes or something, they can just delete that part of the audio.
Sure.
So, but it's long been my dream to do a podcast, and I'm going to look into it a bit more and perhaps see if I can do something maybe along the lines of I don't know if you remember Will Eisner's Shop Talk, where it was talking to other cartoonists, but just about the tricks of the trade and the techniques and what happens in the office, what happens when you sat at the drawing board. And, I mean, I've been lucky enough. I've been around long enough that I know practically everybody. And I've already said to people like Frank Miller, would you appear? He went, oh, yeah, sure, Dave, a shot, So I'm kind of working on that in the background as well.
That's great to hear, Dave, and you would be great at it. And I mean, honestly, and also, like you said, your relationships. But, that kind of peer-to-peer talk. And I know a few other creators are doing that as well. But, I think your perspective is well needed in the podcast realm. So that would be great. Yeah.
So good. Anyway, enough of me talking about that. Let's talk about what you want to talk to me about.
Well, I obviously want to give you the opportunity to talk about whatever's going on. Is Beyond a Steel Sky, is that the most recent project that you're either working on or were working on recently?
Yeah, it is. I mean, I've got a few other little things bubbling away in the background, but beneath this, Beyond a Steel Skies is likely to be the next thing of mine that actually appears. So we can talk about that by all means. Okay,
great. Well, and honestly, if it's okay, I like a lot of what we were talking about just in terms of this, unless you don't want it revealed that you're thinking about doing the podcast.
No.
Okay,
yeah.
Great. Well, all that's good. And then I will officially welcome you, Dave Gibbons, back to Word Balloon. It's been far too long since you've been on the podcast, but it's always great to talk to you. It's always great to see you. And I had a crazy infection that kind of kept me on the sidelines for a lot of the conventions last year, but I'm fully healed. And it's wonderful to hear your voice. And yeah, thanks for coming back.
Good. Well, thanks, John. It's always a pleasure to be here. Always a pleasure to talk to you. I'm pleased that you're better now. And, let's hope we bump into each other in the flesh at a convention before long.
Yeah, what's your schedule? We should say right up front as far as coming to the U.S. and doing shows.
Well, I've had a few invitations, but because I'm juggling a few other professional commitments and a few personal things as well, we seem to have lots of weddings and things this year, that I think I can say pretty definitely that I'm going to be at San Diego and New York, cool. And possibly a couple of others. I'm going to a European convention in Monaco at the middle of March. I did a couple recently. I did one in Greece and I did one in Spain. Yeah. So these things seem to pop up all the time. And what's great is there are more and more conventions these days, and many of them in places that I haven't yet visited and would very much like to visit. So hopefully I'll be coming to a convention near you, dear listener, sometime soon.
Are international conventions still fun, Dave? Because I can also appreciate they're not making air travel that much easier. And of course, too, I imagine you're doing some train traveling as well to some of these shows.
Well, yeah. I mean, you can get to most places in France and Western Europe on the train very easily from London, which is a great way to travel. But I don't mind climbing on an aircraft. I shudder to think about what my carbon footprint has been, but I do continue to travel, and of course my wife likes to travel with me these days, so that also has an effect on the places we visit. Because although I would like to spend hours and hours and hours, in crowded convention halls just rapping on and on about comics, Helen likes to do the more normal things like go and look at the sights and enjoy the sunshine. So that's kind of made a difference to the places that I go to these days.
So did you say Monaco was one of the places you've been to recently?
That's upcoming in March. It seems to be, the kind of main difference between American and European conventions, not universally so, but it tends to be that a lot of the American conventions are kind of about business. They're about money changing hands and sketches being sold and artwork being traded. A lot of the European ones tend to have a slightly more kind of cultural kind of aspect to them. They're more of an arts festival. Yeah. So that's the main difference between the two. And also the European ones tend to be less intense. I mean, quite honestly, when I do San Diego, I need to lie down for a week afterwards,
Yeah.
Whereas the European ones, I mean, not only are they closer, but they tend to be a bit less intense, and the accent is a lot more on being treated to meals and being looked after. And, in some ways it's quite a restful experience, but I like the variety anyway. And I've got many good friends who I see at conventions in the States, so I'm certainly by no means going to be a stranger.
I understand, man. No, I always say that going especially to San Diego is like very expensive summer camp. Because it is. It's like, oh, hey, it's all my out-of-town friends, and we're all hanging out, and we're having a great time. And, we're crapping money because every day it's really expensive.
I mean, the things I particularly like about San Diego and New York is it seems to be that nearly everybody I know is there. Yeah. So, you're bound to bump into everyone along the way. Although, of course, you quite often end up having the convention conversation, which is, oh, hi, see you later, which is as far as it gets. But anyway, it's all part of the rich tapestry of comics.
Excellent. Well, all right. And now I'll again, because you got to kind of tick off the boxes, and then we can talk about stuff that you're currently working on. But I suppose I have to ask about had you watched the HBO Watchmen series, and if you had, what you thought of it.
Oh, yes, I've watched it, and I've hugely enjoyed it. I think it's a wonderful take on what Alan and I set up. I mean, I was aware of it from quite an early stage. I had quite an early conversation with Damon Lindelof about it, who said basically that unless he could make it really great, he wasn't interested in making it. And he wanted to make sure that it was extremely faithful to what Alan and I had done, and that he was so respectful of it. And he treated me very respectfully as well. And I liked what he had to say, and the fact that, you know, it's not really a sequel. It's not like a Before Watchmen or what was it called? A Doomsday Clock. You know, it's not that kind of thing. It's something which respects the integrity and the separateness of the Watchmen graphic novel, and I think is set sufficiently far away in time and also in a sense in space that it feels fresh and new and isn't leaning on what we did at all. And it's also got the hallmark that I think good fiction always has, that everything that happens in it is unexpected, but on the other hand, inevitable. You know, yeah, of course this was what was going to happen. Yeah, and of course, I mean, I won't spoil it for anybody who hasn't seen it, but of course this character was what this character was and not what we thought. If that doesn't sound too oblique. But no, I thought the execution of the whole thing, I thought the acting talent, I thought the way it was shot, I thought the storytelling, it was really just compelling TV, and I certainly waited for each episode to appear with huge expectation and sat with slack jaw and watched it. And I could actually have seen previews of it, but of course, things being what they are these days, everybody's so worried about stuff leaking that the only way I could watch it was on a tiny letterbox screen with a time ticker in the corner and my name watermarked across it. So rather than watch it in advance, I watched it when it was broadcast. And yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed it. It seems to me that Damon's decision is not to do any more unless he gets another really brilliant idea of how to do it. And I respect that as well, and I think it's probably always a good thing to leave them wanting more.
It's always been my appreciation of British television that it seems in British television they don't milk a concept, and it is what it is. And if it's only 6 episodes, so be it. I think back to Life on Mars a couple of years ago. Wow, a lot of years ago. Now that I think about it.
Yeah.
But yeah, you know, that they were starting their second season, and I remember the producers saying, "Look, this isn't Quantum Leap. The guy's in a coma. We can't keep him in a coma for years. It has to make sense." And I agree with you. I absolutely agree with you as far as Lindelof's decision. And it was like great place to end the story. It could go on possibly, but this is a great way to end it. And man, Regina King just knocked it out of the park. She was so great.
She was just fantastic, and I was lucky enough to get to meet most of the cast, including Regina and Jean Smart, and of course Jeremy Irons as well, the great British actor. And I got to meet them at the convention in New York, where they wheeled me on as a sort of a surprise guest halfway through the panel, which was a huge, if not daunting, thing to do. And when I met Regina, she said to me, "Hey, Dave, it's great to meet you. Can I give you a hug?" So she gave me a hug, and it was such a lovely. She's so fearsome in the series. It was nice to see that she's a woman with a great heart and a lovely, lovely woman. So yeah, I think she just knocked her role out of the park. It was just so compelling.
And Jean Smart too, and I mean someone that we're used to in comedic roles, and every time she steps away from comedy, she shows what kind of strong actor she is. And I'm always, you know, I'm a huge fan of hers going back to the early 90s. She did a great movie with Robert Wool and De Niro and all those, Mistress. And I love that movie too. Oh, there you go, you know. Yeah,
and she had this tremendous chemistry going with Regina as well. You know, that I think the time they were together on screen was some of my favourite moments in the whole thing. So yeah, we were blessed with a great showrunner and a great cast and fantastic support as well from everybody.
That's cool. And I wonder, Dave, as far as streaming TV goes now, is anyone sniffing around at like the originals or some of the other things that you've come up with yourself over the years?
Well, we have taken the originals for a walk round the block. We haven't been invited into anywhere just yet, although we've had a lot of very strong interest in it. And of course, it's something which is very close to my heart because, in a sense, it's kind of autobiographical. So I would love it if we could do something with that. Also, I suppose the other thing to mention is treatment, which is a thing that I created originally to appear in Dark Horse Presents a few years back, and that we expanded the scope of with Madefire, who do the digital comics that you can on your iPad. Again, that has got a lot of interest in it, and we're currently sprucing that up with a view to trying to get some movement on it. And again, there has been a lot of interest so far. So it's weird. I'm so glad that at a certain point, I suppose it was in the late 80s, that I decided that I wanted to primarily work on creator-owned material, because it does mean that when you get a bit older and you perhaps haven't got the time or the diligence or the eyesight to keep working, that you've got something there in the cupboard that you can dust off and hopefully give a second lease of life. And I'm really enjoying that whole process of pitching stuff and developing stuff, and that's kind of what I spend most of my time doing these days.
Well, that's cool. And also, as we mentioned earlier, the sequel to Beneath a Steel Sky, now Beyond a Steel Sky. And I caught that video that you and Charles, is it Cecil or Cecil? Charles
Cecil.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I saw you guys talk about the new game and everything. Is it out? Yeah. Is it? I mean, I'm sadly not a gamer, so I kind of am a knucklehead when it comes to this world.
No, we've got a deadline coming fast upon us. We were granted a bit of an extension in order that we could get the game out in one piece. There is a thing that happens nowadays where a game will come on the market and then a patch or an additional part of the game will be released later. We resisted that because it was very important to us that the whole game was out and that it was as good as we could possibly make it. I mean, I can take some credit for this in that I'm involved with character design and environment design, and I have a certain input into story and character and so forth. But Charles has got a fantastic team working for him, and it's an amazing thing. It's kind of magic. Like, I'll do a few character sketches, a few variations on a theme, and then do a more finished kind of pencil sketch, and then it goes off, and then I see a 3D model of it that looks exactly like it's stepped from my head, and then I see the character walking around, and I can control the character walking around as well, and so that's a tremendous thrill. And I've done a comic book introduction to it because we discovered with the first game, Beneath a Steel Sky, that to have an introductory comic book is a great way to set the scene and to do a lot of the backstory. So when you hit the game, you go into it full speed. So I've been doing that again with my friends over at Madefire. We've done a motion comic that precedes the game. And sets the whole thing up, and the game looks just fabulous. The original game, Beneath a Steel Sky, which we did back in the early 90s, had hand-painted backgrounds that were scanned in, and the characters were little limited pixel sprites that had a very restricted range of movement, and you couldn't move them backwards and forwards in depth. But now it's fully 3D rendered. We've got a wonderful rendering engine which makes it look like a comic book come to life. The texture and the feel of the artwork, I think, is really exciting and feels very, very fresh. And the gameplay, which is the part of it that I really take no credit for, is just fantastic. Some great games and a lot of great gameplay in there. And I'm not sure exactly when it's going to be out, but probably, I imagine, early April, I think.
Oh, wow.
I'm really excited. And of course, once that comes out, then Charles and I will be doing the round of the conventions, both comics and gaming conventions, and promoting the bejesus out of it.
Sure, absolutely. Forgive me. Tell me about the story behind both Beneath and Beyond.
Well, it's a kind of post-apocalyptic thing. Our main character is a guy called Robert Foster who finds himself in what is essentially the Australian outback. There's clearly been some sort of global catastrophe, which means that only Australia has survived. And he finds himself drawn towards Union City, which is one of the last remaining urban conurbations. I think that's the correct way to say it. And in the first story, it's him combating an evil presence that is within that city. This game you can download and play for free, but the Beyond a Steel Sky is set some years later, maybe not quite 30 years later, but certainly 15 years later, when again he finds himself drawn back to the city, which we now see in all its glory, in which we see all the levels of, and there's an artificial intelligence which is wreaking havoc, and which is his main foe in it. Although there are lots of smaller foes, and there's lots of friends to be made, and there's lots of amusing adventures to be had, and some just brilliant vistas and views and travels around this amazing city. I think that's probably what I would say about it. But I think if you like the original game, which a lot of people did, and although, as I say, personally, I don't take credit for the actual gameplay. My understanding is that gamers loved the gameplay of the first one, and certainly what's going on in the second game is the equal, if not the surpassing of that. So I think I think it's going to do really well, and really excited about getting it out there for people to see. Because of course, like all these things, games much more so than comic books, these things take years to develop. I mean, we've been working on this for the past 3 years or so, I would think.
Wow.
It's not long now, and it'll be out there.
That's excellent, man. And can people access the comic now, or will it be dropped when the game's ready?
It'll be dropped when the game's ready. I mean, this is on Apple Arcade, so you'll be able to play the game there. I'm not sure at the moment what presence there is. I know the last keynote speech that Apple did, where they focused on this game. Where they focused on Apple Arcade. I was really jolted, because I always watch the Apple keynote speeches because I'm a big tech geek and I love Apple stuff. And so they said, and next, Apple Arcade. So Apple Arcade comes up. The first thing I see is a character I've designed walking around Union City. And the next thing I see is my friend Charles Cecil, who he's the guy whose company is developing the game. Mm-hmm. He's there talking, and the first words to come out of his mouth is legendary comic book artist Dave Gibbons. So all of a sudden, wow, that's me. I'm on the Apple keynote. So I thought I was quite cool about these things, but I was absolutely, oh my God, it's great. And I know we're going to get really good support from Apple, and it's a whole new ball game, a whole new way of delivering games, and I think it's going to be really, really exciting.
That's really interesting, man. Do you have, as we were talking about streaming, have you watched Apple TV, any of the Apple shows yet?
I haven't. I mean, there are so many subscription services.
God, yes.
I mean, of course, we've got Netflix. We've got a thing called Now TV, which is essentially shows a lot of HBO stuff, which you need if you want to watch Watchmen.
Sure.
And we've got obviously Amazon Prime as well.
Yep.
So I mean, I do watch a fair raft of stuff. No doubt at some point I will get the Apple TV as well. I mean, they've got some great shows on there. But yeah, so I'll be spending even more evenings slumped in front of the TV with stuff that I just can't miss. So I think it's a golden age for storytelling, and it is a golden age, as I say, if you're lucky enough to have a hand in any original IP. There's a great hunger for stories and exciting and novel concepts out there. So. Yeah, it's a good time to be a creator, I think.
I agree with you. And also, and it's funny because the British culture and the Canadian culture, and I think a lot of other non-U.S. countries have continued to get into audio drama. But I'm so pleased that podcasting and audio, even in the States, has become so important that even audio drama is back in the U.S. and people are generating new things. And I'm an old-time radio fan of the stuff that came out really from the 30s to the early 60s, and I love that stuff. And the opportunity to create new stuff as well is so exciting, and I'm so glad so many people are doing it. I want to get involved in that because I'm such a fan of the medium, you know?
Sure. Well, I mean, when you do what I do for a living, you spend a lot of time listening to the radio, and I mean practically everything that I've ever drawn in comics, I've had talk shows on, or latterly I've had podcasts. And of course, we have a great public broadcasting system, the British Broadcasting Corporation, which does great radio drama and readings and plays and stuff. A good friend of mine is a guy called Dirk Maggs, who's done audio adaptations of a lot of comic book stuff. He did some fantastic Superman adaptations in the 90s, Spider-Man. He's recently done an audio version of Good Omens, with Neil Gaiman.
Yeah, the Amazon Prime show, sure. And, of course, Dave Gaiman stuff, or Neil's stuff,
And I mean, what he says about radio, and it's true, is that radio has the best pictures. Yep. Because there's that wonderful bit of you use your own imagination, and he's worked on the Hitchhiker's Guide, and indeed, while I'm talking about things that are up and coming, I'm actually having a meeting tomorrow about a thing that he and I have had in development for a while, and it's really interesting to work with him because comics have got everything except the sound in a way. So to work with somebody whose speciality is working without the pictures, we kind of meld together in a really interesting way. So, I absolutely agree with you about radio and podcasts. There's a thing I listen to over here that's broadcast on one of our channels. I believe it's called Radio Lab.
Sure.
And they do incredible documentaries and wonderful things with the sound to make it more than just voices talking in an empty landscape. And I'm absolutely fascinated by the texture and the interest that they give, just the spoken word. And indeed, as we were saying before we really got going on this, I'm very tempted to try and do a podcast myself. I used to really like in the Will Eisner Spirit magazine, he used to do a thing called Shop Talk, which was essentially him talking to his contemporaries about the nuts and bolts and the actual craft and experience of doing comics. And I've got a hankering to do something like that. And I've already spoken to a few of my rather well-known colleagues, and they've expressed great enthusiasm. And over the years, I suppose I've got to know practically everybody who does work in comics anyway, and I absolutely love the nuts and bolts stuff, the kind of inside baseball stuff. So I'm kind of planning on doing something like that. And again, my son actually is a co-presenter on a gaming podcast over here. He was never much interested in comics, but he's always been really a big fan of games, and he knows a lot of the technical ins and outs of doing really good sounding a podcast. So I'm mulling it over, and I shall certainly let everybody know once I've recorded a couple of episodes.
I can't wait, man. I hope you do it. And I'm a huge fan of Shop Talk. and it's one of the best features on. John Cook made that great documentary about Will Eisner, and he had the audio from those original cassette conversations, and it's so great to hear Jack Kirby unfiltered and very comfortable talking to Will and all of the people. My God, especially Milton Caniff and some of these great names that it's so wonderful to hear their words. I mean, the transcripts are great too. But I always say, as I'm sure you know too, you just kind of miss the nuance of what they're saying. So you understand when they're being snide or when they're joking or whatever.
Oh, sure. And of course, the truth is, whenever comic book artists or writers come together, what we talk about in the bar is not, let's do a graphic novel and change the world. It's so what kind of pens do you use, or what drawing software do you use, or hey, the quality of that paper's really gone off. Do you know a good substitute for it? So that's the kind of thing that artists love to talk about, because we all think that somewhere out there is the perfect pen. If we just had a certain pen point, then we could draw as well as Will Eisner or Milton Caniff or Jack Kirby, or if we just had the right paper, or if we just used the right pencil. So there's always this holy grail, and I'd love to just talk about producing comic art, because it's been my lifelong fascination. And I remember when I was trying to break into the field, how hard it was to find out exactly what was the right kind of ink to use or the right kind of paper. We all sit here working, and we all develop our own philosophies. We all suffer from the same epiphanies and depressions, depending whether the work is going well or badly, and always trying to figure out what makes it go well, and how we can not get artist block, and what's the best way to deal with a picture that just won't be drawn, and should we just put a timer on and just, give ourselves 27 and a half minutes to do each picture and then move on. There's all these kind of things which, we're absolutely obsessed with. And I think, like anything, it's always good to listen to people talk with enthusiasm. When I'm drawing comics, I listen, as I said, to all sorts of things. I never, ever do any gardening. I never, ever go out in the garden and plant anything. But there's a program over here called Gardener's Question Time, and I love to listen to that. I don't know what they're talking about, but I just love the enthusiasm. So hopefully, if I can dragoon a few of my pals into it, we can allow people to overhear some really interesting yet baffling discussions between us.
There was an American public radio show called Car Talk, and it was out of Boston. And it was these two mechanics, and they were just so charming, and just like you described about your gardening show, that's what hooked people in. You didn't have to be an auto freak to appreciate it. And it really was people with, regular car problems. I have a 1992 Datsun, and it still won't do X. And it's like, what you need to do is, and it's great, and especially in those great Boston accents, it was charming as hell. Absolutely, man.
And of course, people love to share their knowledge. I mean, this is a huge thing on the internet. If ever I have to fix something around the house, I'll just click on Google and go, fixing leaking tap, and then there'll be 100 people who've got exactly that piece of equipment and who know the 100 ways to do it, So hopefully it'll be an interest. It would be, if I get round to doing it, an interesting resource as well that people can turn to in times of difficulty.
So I don't know if I ever asked you, are you still drawing on paper, or have you, and again, I know you're a big tech guy. Are you using a Cintiq or something similar? I'm going to leave it at Cintiq. What are you doing with your drawing these days?
Yeah, well, I've always loved tech, and I was, I suppose, quite an early adapter of the computer to do comics with. I mean, way back in like 1991 or so, it became obvious that the way to color comics was on the computer.
Sure.
And then that the way to letter them was on the computer. And then as the software got more and more intuitive, it was clear that it made sense to draw on the computer as well. So, for a start, I don't do anything like as much drawing as I used to. But when I do draw, certainly to one degree or the other, the computer is involved in it. And I have got a Wacom Cintiq tablet, and I've got very, very used to drawing on that. In fact, you may have heard me say this before, but the point at which I realised that drawing on the computer had become completely natural to me was when I'd drawn a few lines and I'd completely filled an area with solid black, which of course on the computer is just one click of the paint bucket tool. And then I moved my hand up to draw something else and I went, oh shit, because I thought I'd smudged the ink that I just laid down. So that was the point at which it became real for me. But no, the software has become so good. There's a particular piece of software called Clip Studio, which is very, very widely used in professional comics these days, which does all the things that you dreamed you would be able to do back in the days of doing everything by hand. It's incredible just for kind of ruling pages up and laying lettering in and getting perspective guides. I mean, again, it is really just a tool. It isn't going to do the work for you. And it is easy to be intimidated by it or to go to make harder work of it than you need. But I've essentially got it set up so I've got a digital equivalent of my favourite real-world tools. I've got all my page sizes set, so all I have to do is click New Document, which makes things easier. And, of course, all comic art is delivered digitally these days, sure. So it makes that whole aspect of it better. And, of course, people still want to buy original artwork. So I will, even if I don't do the complete job on the computer, which, of course, leaves you with no original artwork.
Right.
At all. I'll do some sort of hybrid thing where I'll pencil on the computer and then print it out and then ink over that on board with ink. So, I mean, I think it's become an indispensable tool these days. And the software is now completely intuitive. So I think even non-technical people find themselves working digitally now, and it's just part of the general evolution of the form, I think.
Understood. And also, I think back to that great Frank Frazetta documentary, Playing with Fire, that was made. And when he had his stroke and his drawing hand was affected, his right hand was affected by it, and his doctor told him, Frank, the talent's in your head. You can retrain that left hand to do what you've always done with your right hand. And certainly now with technology, it's that much easier. But isn't that great? And it is that epiphany of, it's inside, man. It's just the hand is a tool. So so just use another tool. I mean, that's fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, I had a few problems. Now, hopefully, and not hopefully, actually resolved with my vision. And when I couldn't see too well for a little bit, to draw on the computer was great because I could blow it up and then I could see what I was doing, sure. And so from that point of view, and I know people as well who have got hand problems or wrist problems who have found that drawing digitally has been their salvation as well. I mean, but no, you're absolutely right that the technology. Well, it's like I was saying about having a magic pencil or a magic pen point. You can use the same pen as or the same brush as a great inker like Joe Sinnott or Frank Giacoia, but you're never going to be able to do those lines because those lines are in your head. And it's the same with the computer as well. When I tell people that I do it on the computer, they think that somehow I just press click Superman and it'll draw Superman. And then I go, click, flying, and then the figure will then fly. It's not quite as easy as that. But I think what it is really, what the computer does is remove a lot of the kind of monkey work from it. The sort of the stuff that you would maybe have got an assistant to do in the past, like ruling stuff up or doing corrections or filling in solid blacks. I think that's when it really is a time saver. But you're still going to have to sit there and sweat your way through it and work out what you're going to draw and how you're going to draw it.
You had obviously for Watchmen, but also, and I love talking about in particular that Superman annual, The Man Who Had Everything.
Oh yeah,
or For the Man Who Had Everything, and formatically, you and Alan really came up with that story language that and panel progression. At least it seemed to us as readers that's where there was a shift in your style. Do you feel that way in terms of, was that a conscious shift that you used progressively in other works, or was it really specifically for those moments when you were doing those types of stories?
Well, in all the work that I've done with Alan, we always worked quite closely together and would discuss how we were going to, do certain bits of storytelling. And he, like me, was a tremendous fan of, the real masters, the giants on whose shoulders we stand, people like Will Eisner, people like Harvey Kurtzman, Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko. And so, a lot of the storytelling effects that we used in that Superman annual, which was actually was written and drawn at the point that we were designing Watchmen. It was what we were doing to make money while we were spending time developing Watchmen.
Sure.
A lot of those storytelling tricks found their way into both the Superman annual and the Watchmen series. And they were the things like keeping a fixed viewpoint while the background changed, or keeping the background the same but moving the camera across it. Mm-hmm. And I think really we sort of brought some storytelling things to Superman that maybe hadn't been brought to him before. But I think that was really not specifically for that series. I think we would have been coming up with those solutions whatever we've been working on. But the thing that's always fascinated me about comics, and what I consider to be the art of comics, is how you break the story down into pictures. The art of comics isn't actually the drawing, and it isn't the writing. It's that bit where they coalesce, and it becomes story. It becomes graphic story. And it was a huge treat with that Superman annual, which has to be one of my favourite things that I've ever worked on, because it was Superman, who is the granddaddy of them all, who was the superhero I first loved. To have it written by Alan, who clearly is one of the best comic book writers ever. Sure. And also, and least but not last, to have it edited by Julie Schwartz, who had edited all my favourite comic books when I was growing up. It was like the perfect alignment of the planets. It was a very exciting thing to work on, and it was good to stretch Superman a bit and import some of our storytelling ideas that we've been thinking of in the context of Watchmen, I suppose.
Did he have any advice or guidance? I mean, because again, you guys, I always say forgive the generalization, but I do love when British creators in particular work on American comics, because it seems all of you have come with a cool, interesting perspective that I think the average American reader is like, oh, I never thought of it that way, whether it's visual or in the actual script. And I mean, so was Julie just like, hey, this is great, just keep going? Or did he have anything to say that you guys used in the books?
Well, Julie, in many ways, was very old school.
Sure.
And I mean, he was a great editor to work for. He gave us a reasonable deadline. He didn't lean on us too much. All the checks came through on time. All the mistakes we made were edited out. But the thing that Julie liked the best, because it was, if you like, the height of the British invasion. There was Alan and me and Brian Bolland and Kevin O'Neill and Mick McMahon and Alan Davis and a whole lot of people coming in, Neil Gaiman eventually, that I think, Julie was just absolutely thrilled and flattered to find that us young Turks were big fans of his comic books. And he did for both. Well, for myself and for Brian Bolland and for Alan as well, he let us choose some comics from his file drawer. The first time I was ever in the DC offices was, okay, so appropriately enough, there was a convention in Chicago, and that was the first big American convention that I'd been to, paid for by DC. And it was there that Julie Schwartz asked me, would you like to draw some Superman? I said, yeah, who's going to write it? He said, who do you want to write it? I said, I'd like Alan Moore to write it. He said, fine, fix it up. So I then went with the DC party back to New York, and on Julie's desk phoned Alan up and said, hey, there's this chance to do a Superman story. And I knew he had a good idea already because he told me this brilliant story about Krypton not exploding some months before. So we found ourselves doing that. And after that phone call with Alan, Julie said, oh, so you're a big fan of my work, of my comics, Dave? And I said, yeah. He said, have you got them all? And I said, well, I've got all the Green Lantern, Flash, Atom, Justice League, but there's lots of Mystery in Space and Strange Adventures that I don't have. He said, okay, come with me. So he took me out to where he kept his files of comics, and he opened this big file drawer and said, help yourself to a few.
Oh, Jesus.
So I start riffling through it. He goes, no, go old. So I'm down in sort of Strange Adventures number 4 and 5. He said, yeah, sure, help yourself. And I took about 7 or 8, and he went, that's enough for now. You can have some more another time. So I came away with those, and then he let Alan, when Alan showed up the next year, Alan got to go through the drawer. And then Brian Bolland turned up, and he got to go through the drawer. And Julie said to me, hey, you're big friends with Dave Gibbons, aren't you? And Brian said, yeah. He said, oh, I can't really give you any comics if I don't give Dave some as well. So choose some for Dave. So, and Brian, to his credit, I mean, he could have just kept them and I never would have known, but he came back and gave me a handful of comics. And just to complete this thought, the thing that was most amazing was after we'd done the Superman annual, a brown manila envelope arrived from New York one day, and it was from Julie. I could tell from the handwriting, and inside it was a copy of Mystery in Space #1. It really beat up, but it was just about complete. And on it, Julie had written a #1 comic for a #1 artist, your pal, Julie Schwartz. And that was just like absolutely incredible. I mean, I welled up a little bit of that because that was, having been such a huge fan of his work. So, yeah, Julie was thrilled that us young Turks were such fans of his as we were, as he was fans of ours by that time. So it felt very good, very cozy, and it was a great story. And I think the fact that it was a complete limited story, it was 40 pages and done. It wasn't a long continuity. It was while the mythology of Superman that we'd grown up with was still in place, before it was updated. And indeed, Alan got to write the finale story for Superman, basically. Yes. It just felt good. It was the planets in alignment, and it's been reprinted God knows how many times. Every time they do a best of Superman, or it seems to show up, and they adapted it for a Justice League animated TV feature.
Absolutely.
And they use some of the ideas in the Supergirl TV series. So, yes. Yeah, I think that was a good few months' work that Alan and I did there.
Are any of the CW shows using any of your concepts? And I'm always so happy to hear that, people that did create characters or scenarios are being compensated for it when they adapt them for television. And obviously, I'm hoping that was the case back with the Justice League cartoon, but I wonder with the current group of shows that are out there.
Oh yeah, obviously being Superman and it being done as work for hire, really we had no particular right to expect any further income from it. But no, they've been as good as gold. We got a check for the Justice League animated thing. I believe we possibly got some participation for the Supergirl thing as well.
Terrific.
And of course, the other nice thing about it is that so many of the people who now work in these fields grew up as comic fans. So much as we revered Julie Schwartz's generation, they kind of revere us, and they tend to deal very fairly with us and are very respectful of us and of the material. So, yeah, I mean, it's always a great thrill to see something. And even with, I mean, I've had little things to sign even for, you know, odd members of the Green Lantern Corps that I may have been the first person to draw. You know,
That's what I was wondering. Yes.
Yeah. So I mean, outside of that particular story, I don't watch everything by any means. I'm not aware of particular instances, but certainly, yeah, the good news is that the concepts they use, they do tend to compensate people for. And I think also it's been great with the recent spate of superhero movies, both DC and Marvel, that they do make an attempt to credit the original creators on screen, because I think that's very, very important. So, yeah, you know, I think they're at least trying to do things right. And certainly, even though corporations may find it difficult sometimes, I think the individuals within them tend to be quite respectful.
That's good to hear, because again, I mean, and truly, as yourself as a participant in that struggle with creator owned, and also when you create something, as you say, for work for hire, when they become classics, you know, I always, you know, I said. And I always feel bad, and then luckily I can talk to you about it, and you know where I'm coming from. But before Watchmen came out, and certainly there was a lot of controversy, and truly as a co-creator, I can appreciate whatever feelings you had about it, and I won't ask you to voice anything you don't want to. But you know, yeah, it's that tug of war of, well, yeah, these guys should really have control over it because they created it. But then on the other hand, it's work for hire. My phrase was, well, nobody expected Moby Dick. And you and Alan created Moby Dick with Watchmen and stuff, and it's like, if the publisher's got the right to do it, it is a business.
Yeah,
this thing keeps making money. I understand the feeling of, well, why don't we do another? And again, we talked about Lindelof telling a great story within your universe, and then succeeding with it. So it seems like, again, and it sounds like what you're saying, that it is a better environment than what it was back in the 80s.
Yeah, I mean, I've made my thoughts about Before Watchmen and Doomsday Clock quite clear, which is basically, I wish they hadn't done them. I mean, the thing about it is, obviously, financially, Alan and I have benefited. And also, there is the other thing about it, which means that these things drive people back to the original material, which means, say, for instance, with the Watchmen movie, and, movies of themselves, as you may be aware, I'm sure a lot of your listeners will be, never actually make any money because the bookkeeping is done in such a way that they don't make any money.
True. Yes.
Lord of the Rings apparently didn't make any money. Kingsmen didn't make any money. Watchmen didn't make any money. But what Watchmen did was drive people, back to the original graphic novel. When the first trailer for the Watchmen movie appeared with one of the Dark Knight movies, we sold more copies of the graphic novel in 3 months than we'd sold in the preceding 25 years.
Wow.
So it had, that sort of thing has a tremendous effect. And that's the consolation, that even if you don't like what's been subsequently done with the property, at least it's making people look at what you originally did. And it's meant that hundreds of thousands of people have read Alan's words, looked at my pictures. So, that's some comfort you can gain from it. But I think on a creative level, it's always a very thorny thing. That's why I think the best sequels or the best reinterpretations are a long way removed from the originals. I mean, even if you think of things that Alan has done, for instance, with something like Lost Girls, where it's kind of revisiting established fictional characters, the fact that he's doing it 100 years after their original popularity makes it an entirely different thing than if he'd done it the next year.
Sure.
It becomes different. And I think that's so of what Damon Lindelof did with Watchmen, that it went off in such a different direction. It was such an unusual and inventive way to do it, that it really, its echo never will reach Watchmen itself, because, it's so removed. I hope that's clear.
Sure.
And, you know, I don't want to be a miserable old curmudgeon about these things. But sometimes you think to yourself, well, I wish they hadn't done that. And that's kind of how I feel. It's terrible. I'm outraged. It's just, well, I couldn't stop them from doing it. I'm just sorry they did do it. You know, in the case of the close Watchmen comic book material, certainly.
Have you ever read, I'm a huge Sherlock Holmes fan, and it's really been interesting to discover the Sherlock Holmes knockoffs that were happening in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And it's fascinating to see that stuff. And also having the perspective of, hey, guess what? This isn't anything new. This has been going on for 100 years. So let's not be surprised.
But I mean, you know, times change and commercial concerns are quite amorphous, and they evolve as well. I mean, for many, many years, the regime at DC Comics ensured that nothing was done with Watchmen at all because they knew that Alan and I didn't want anything to be done with it. Then, of course, the regime changes. It gets swallowed up by a larger concern. People who have no idea who me and Alan are think, well, hold on, there's this thing here which has made a ton of money, and it could make us a ton more money. Why aren't we doing anything with this? And I absolutely see from a commercial point of view, it's irresistible, you know. I mean, I was really pleased, and I really respected the fact that DC did treat it with kid gloves, not because it's a thing that's so wonderful and beautiful and so you know, beyond the concerns of the world that it should never be meddled with. But I think they realised that actually, from a creative point of view, the correct thing to do was to leave it. And so, you know, I'm just grateful that they did that. And as for what was eventually done, well, it's another day at the office, and you know, that's just the way things go.
Understood. You know, I wonder as a fan, I wanted to expand on that and what you thought of, and then you clearly do understand the business side of it and stuff, but what you've described is really, I think, what we're seeing in Star Wars, Star Trek, and corporations have really taken over, not only paying the bills, but really have gotten involved in the creative end. And you're getting that, you know, like you said, I wish they hadn't done it. Maybe I wish they hadn't done it that way. I mean, I'm a longtime Star Trek fan, going back to, you know, the early 70s as a little kid. And hell, I even remember in '69 vaguely seeing Star Trek on the TV screen when I was probably 4 years old or whatever. Yeah. But you know, I watched the new one, and I can't help but, and I don't want to be a troll. I don't think of myself as a troll. But it just seems like the corporation attitude is, well, we need, you know, they love R2-D2. Let's get something like R2-D2, but let's make it our own. So there's BB-8. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's that old thing, you know. What was the golden age of science fiction? And the answer is 12. You know? And that's always going to be the case. If you loved Star Trek when you were 12, you've got all the memories and all the excitement and the joy and that warm, fuzzy, nostalgic feeling that nothing is ever going to approach again. The most you will be able to do is to say, well, at least they didn't trash it too badly, or at least they understood it, or at least, you know. But of course, fans, I love the fans. I'm a fan myself, but fans have a very particular view of things that isn't really shared by the worldwide audience at all. So they always feel that they're the ones who are right about properties. And indeed, I mean, you see it in music as well, you know, that you have a band that you really, really love, and they're on an independent label and nobody's heard them, and you love them and you love them. When they sign the big deal with the major label and they're there on MTV or whatever the modern equivalent is, you don't like them anymore because, you know, they're not yours anymore. And there's always that with being a fan of something. And I feel it too. And it isn't a bad thing, but you have to recognize that it's a particular way of looking at things. And of course, as I say, with maturity as well, you do realize that these things all exist in the commercial world, and the commercial world is a completely different beast again. But I think the thing is,
to be positive, and I really do feel positive. It is great that so many people who grew up loving this stuff are now in a position of power, even at these larger corporations. And I think, it's also been demonstrated, I think, particularly with the Marvel movies, that the truer you stay to the original vision, the more successful the film is likely to be. And I think that has been one of the successes of the Marvel movies, that they've really, kind of told the stories that Stan and Jack and Steve Ditko and so on told, but just on the big screen. They've stayed very true to the core message and the core feeling and the core characters. And hopefully, that message has been received now, that, it's best to stick with the vision of the originators.
I haven't had a chance to watch Harley Quinn yet, but I do agree with you, and I think that even, the Wonder Woman movie was great. And the Aquaman movie was a lot of fun.
It was.
And yeah, really interesting and stuff. So, did you watch the CW crossover of Crisis this year?
I didn't. Again, so much streaming, so little time, and I've rather fallen behind with all that stuff. I think I'm up to date on the actual movies, although I haven't seen Birds of Prey yet. But otherwise, I think I'm fairly much up to speed. And I agree with you as well that Wonder Woman, I thought, was hugely successful, I felt really kind of sorry for DC in a way, because they're trying to find their way, and they've been so outshone by what Marvel has seemingly effortlessly seemed to do, and of course continued to do with all the confidence that success breeds. Whereas I think there was it seemed to me a certain amount of second guessing went on with some of the DC movies, and they were perhaps rather overinflated, whereas they could have done with slightly simpler storylines. I think maybe I don't want to get too much into that, because I know a lot of hard work and a lot of creativity goes into them. But I think as a lifelong DC fan, I had a sad feeling the way it turned out with some of the DC movies, whereas as a not particularly Marvel fan, not to the same degree that I used to love DC anyway, I absolutely loved all their movies and was first in line to see them as they came out, and always saw them in IMAX 3D and absolutely, loved them. Are you okay with time? I don't want to. We're at about an hour, and I always have a million more questions. Oh, great! Sure. I'll talk as long as you want me to, but you know that, don't you?
No, I honestly, Dave, I never want to, impose, and I know it's evening where you're at, and whatever plans you might have for the evening, I certainly don't want to get in the way. This is what happens when we're 7 hours, behind.
I'm happy to ramble on for a bit longer.
Okay, I appreciate that. I should ask, because a couple things have happened since our last talk. I know they're making a Kingsman prequel.
Yeah.
And how has that phenomenon been? I think the first movie, it was amazing. Second movie, not so much, but I am intrigued by the prequel. And how's that experience been for you?
Well, it's strange. It's been, to be honest, quite a hands-off experience for me.
Okay.
The whole Kingsman thing was largely cooked up by Mark Miller and Matthew Vaughn, who got to chatting in the pub and were bemoaning the fact that, you didn't get any really good spy movies, whereas you used to have, James Bond and the one with, I'm blanking on the guy's name now, but, or things like things like the Ipcrest File, or all those great old spy things,
Absolutely. Were you thinking of
James Coburn, I was thinking of.
Oh, James Coburn, Flint.
Yeah. Our man Flint, wasn't it?
Absolutely, our man Flint. And I was thinking too, like all the great Michael Caine stuff, like how Harry Palmer, his character. God, those movies were fantastic. I love 60s spy movies. I'm totally with you, Dave. Those things are amazing. And so,
Mark and Matthew sort of saw that there was an area there which wasn't really covered, and Mark and I had been wanting to do something together for a long, long time. In Mark's case, since he was about 16 years old when he wrote me a fan letter. Anyway, so we got to the point where we both had some time, and he said, "Hey, do you fancy doing a spy comic?" And I thought, well, that's great because I've done so much superhero stuff, so much science fiction stuff. I thought, yeah, a spy comic would be great because it's larger than life and it's imaginative, but it's kind of an area that I haven't been in before. So we started developing that. And Matthew started developing the movie earlier than he thought he was going to do it. But it was a question of timing. There was a Man from U.N.C.L.E. movie coming out, and he wanted to make sure that Kingsman appeared before that. So the comic book and the movie were kind of developed in parallel. And if you've read the book and seen the movie, you realise that in many ways it is kind of the same story, but a lot of the incidentals in it are different. A lot of the characterizations are different. And so it's not like a straight adaptation one way or the other. So I had really no input into the movie, other than the visualizations and the contribution I made to the comic book. So it was really great to see that movie because, again, I could say that was a great movie without being immodest in any way, which, of course, us Englishmen never like to be immodest about anything. And I agree with you, that first movie, there's hardly anybody I know who didn't love that movie. And it did so many things right. Originally, when Mark and I were going to do it, it was going to be set in the USA, and it was going to be called Uncle Sam, and it was going to be about a kid and his uncle whose name happened to be Sam. And I actually did some designs based on that. But the minute we made it a British thing where we could get into all the nuances of the British class system and, that whole kind of snobbery thing and working class rebellion kind of thing, then it really came alive for us. So it was great to see that first movie. I think I would have to agree with you that the second movie, again, it was the second movie, so it was never going to have the novelty of the first movie. But I mean, I still enjoyed it, but it was aiming at a high bar. I think it's really interesting that they've taken the step of kind of going back in time and at this point doing the origin of it, because I think that's quite an interesting thing to know. And from what I know about it and from the footage I've seen, I think it's going to, again, kind of reinforce that British class thing, which, again, I think is so important to it. I don't know, but I'm hoping that there will then be another movie, which would be Eggsy, who was the kid in the first two movies, yes, now being the man himself, now essentially being the Kingsman. And so I've got hopes. I've got, as I say, I've got no inside knowledge at all that we will eventually see him in full flight. And if that was the case, I think it would make a really nice trilogy of films and an origin story. So, we'll have to see how that pans out. But certainly I've had a load of fun. I got to meet Samuel L. Jackson, who is every bit as cool and as much of a gentleman as you always thought he would be. And I've got to walk the red carpet several times. So, yes, it's been a great experience.
That's excellent, man. And Taron, is it Egerton or Edgerton?
Taron Egerton, yeah.
Egerton, my God, that kid has really just come on the scene, and good for him, man. He's a great actor. You can't take your eyes off him. I love that the ski jumping movie he made. Eddie the Eagle was great in Rocket Man.
Oh yeah,
but Eddie the Eagle. It's like, I don't care about this story, and it's like, holy shit, this is a great movie.
Yeah. He's a very accessible actor. I've got to know him a little bit, and he's a really, really nice guy, tremendously talented. And I mean, he really sold that first Kingsman movie. He was so believable, and you were so empathic, and you liked him so much that was a wonderful thing to do. And as you say, he skied and he sang all the songs in Rocket Man, which I thought was a great movie, and he obviously threw himself completely into that. And you believed that he was Elton John, So
yes,
I'd go and see anything that he was in, even if it wasn't something that I had an interest in.
I agree, man. I haven't watched Robin Hood yet, but eventually I'll get to it because, he's so charming and stuff. I am curious to see his take on it. Len Wein passed since we've spoken, and it's been a couple of years now. And any thoughts of working with Len over the years?
Well, I mean, Len was part of the same generation as me, and I mean, he was one of the first people to break from fandom into mainstream professional comics, and he loved comics. I mean, he was a comics guy to his soul. He was a personification of that particular era of American comics, and of course he created some wonderful. I mean, he created Swamp Thing, he created Wolverine, didn't he? And he wrote so many great comic books. I got to work with him a bit on Green Lantern, which I enjoyed. Although the thing I would say about Len, and this is not to badmouth him at all, but it was a little difficult because he was my writer and my editor. And normally if the writer is late, you can complain to the editor, but if the writer is the editor, you're just complaining twice. And so there were some moments now forgotten and forgiven where I was quite exasperated with Len, but I think that was part of his charm, and he was the warmest and nicest and, I don't know, most cuddly of men. And I've got fond memories. I actually came across a photo the other day that I didn't even know existed, which was when we'd been doing Green Lantern, he made a trip to London and he was staying with Brian Bolland, who had a flat in the middle of London. And I went up there a couple of times and we had a couple of plotting sessions with Green Lantern, and it was a picture of me and Len sat on the sofa, young, unlined, with hair. It was an astonishing thing to see. So, but no, I mean, he's left a wonderful legacy, and he's definitely there in the Comic Book Hall of Fame.
Did he have any, again, with Watchmen and everything, and just like Julie with the Superman story, was there any decent input from him? And not what I mean, not to characterize it only as decent, but I mean, something that actually did impact the direction of the story that you guys were telling.
Well, I mean, in all honesty, I would have to say that DC really left me and Alan alone to do Watchmen, and it was clear. And I mean, I think a good editor knows when to step in and when not to step in.
Absolutely.
And I think maybe Len got the gig because obviously I knew him well from doing Green Lantern, and he obviously Alan was working on Swamp Thing, which was again Len's baby, right. Really. And I rather imagine that's why he became the editor of Watchmen. I think he dropped out after maybe the first 6 or 7 issues, and Barbara Randall then took over as editor. But it was quite seamless to me and Alan, because basically Alan would write the scripts, I would draw them and letter them, John Higgins would colour them, and only at that point would DC really see what was going on. And I think it became quite obvious to them that we could be trusted to deliver the goods. I really can hardly remember talking to DC editorial at all during the process of doing Watchmen. So,
okay.
Yeah, but as I say, that's what a good editor does. They step in if they need to, but if they don't, they don't get in the way of the cooks.
Are there genres left, Dave, that you haven't had a chance to really do a story in that you want to? It seems like now more than ever, and I'm so thrilled because of it, that the readership is more interested beyond the classic tropes of the superhero story. And in fact, you mentioned Strange Adventures and Adam and Mystery in Space. Yeah. I'm good friends with Tom King, and Tom let me see that first issue and told me about the direction he's going to take this Adam Strange story in. And granted, it's a superhero story, but it's being told in a unique way, that the way the Superman annual, I think, did as well. But, yeah. I mean, are there pure, straight up, like you said, Secret Service, Kingsmen was a straight up spy story. There were no capes. It was more of a real world story. So are there other real world genre kind of stories that you'd like to tackle as a writer or an artist?
Well, I mean, the first thing I'd like to say is that I greatly enjoyed Tom King's writing I mean, I absolutely loved what he and Mitch Gerards did on Mr. Miracle, and I'm really looking forward to Mystery in Space or Strange. It's called Strange Adventures, isn't it?
That's right.
Which is very, very clever. Adam Strange, yeah, great. I mean, of course, what you have to realise with Tom, he is a nerd. Anyway, so no, I mean, I still love my sort of science fiction. I've got there's one particular science fiction story that I'm not even going to tell you what it is, but I would love to do a comic book version of it. It's only a short story, but it's fascinated me since I was a kid. So at some point, I might get around to doing that. I might find out if I could get the rights to it and maybe draw that. I think, I've done, the spy stuff. I've done a certain amount in my really early days of kind of World War II stuff, which that was a real staple of British comics when I was growing up. There were a whole series of comics like War Picture Library, Battle Picture Library, Air Ace Picture Library. And so that's still an area that appeals to me, although I did get a chance to do a story with Garth Ennis, who is, again, a huge war story fan. So maybe I've scratched that itch a bit. But I haven't really done much kind of historical stuff. And although growing up, history was not one of my favourite school subjects because it all seemed to be about dates and acts of parliament and battles and really obscure stuff with people with strange names. The older I get, the more fascinated I am by history and how it resonates and repeats and echoes.
Yes.
So if I could come across the right historical property, that might be an interesting thing to do. And also, strangely, the older I get, the more I enjoy doing research and trying to make things look real, because it is a truism, but truth is so much more interesting than fiction, actually. So that's an area that I might be tempted by.
That's cool. That's great, man. And I'm glad to hear that. And also, man, the times that you've only written and someone else has drawn your stories have always been terrific as well. I mean, I've told you before that Captain America story where you had him, debuting in the 2000s and then becoming unfrozen, which of course became part of the movies as well. But I just that's one that sticks in my mind recently. Obviously, Treatment. I haven't seen Treatment. Tell me about Treatment. I'm gonna have to dig that up.
Well, Treatment. It's had a kind of long and winding history. I've always sort of kept a notebook, and I've always written down things that appeal to me at the time I hear them. You're watching the TV or someone will say something in the conversation and you think, oh, that's really good. That's a really interesting little thing. And I would write them down in my little black notebook. And when you look back through notebooks like that, you actually find that things join up a bit. And the reason is that obviously you've written these things down because you in particular find them interesting. So they're all kind of related because they're all things that you're interested in. And Mike Richardson, who's I've known for many, many years, he was reviving Dark Horse Presents, which was their anthology title.
Yes.
And he said, Dave, it would be great to get you to do something in that, just to be a part of it. And I looked through my little black book of notions and sketches and ideas, and I came across the word treatment. Now, what treatment actually was actually a gang of football hooligans in the 70s. And they used to wear like surgical masks, like the ones that I understand there's a world shortage of at the moment because everybody's terrified about the flu.
Yes.
So they used to wear those as a disguise, and they would travel with their soccer team, their football team, and they would beat the fans up in the cities they travelled to, and they would leave a card with them saying, "You have received treatment." Wow. And that stuck with me, and I thought, maybe I could do something with that. And I sort of twisted the idea around a bit and made it so that rather than being overtly bad guys and hooligans, treatment were kind of good guys. But again, it was the notion of, you receive treatment. And then I thought of the kind of, I suppose, rather hackneyed phrase, sometimes the treatment is worse than the disease. Yeah, that could be. So I kind of knocked that about, and I did a fragment. I think about 12 pages. It was a fragment just kind of made up on the hoof of what treatment might do. And then it got picked up by Madefire and turned into one of their early motion books. And then we got some other artists and writers to do stories featuring the same idea. And, it became quite a thing. But now that Madefire are moving into production, they're obviously trying to place the IP that they own or have an interest in. And so the whole thing has been revised. And I've had some really interesting story conferences with my friends at Madefire. And we're now going forward with it. And again, it's evolved a little bit more again. It's probably not appropriate, or we probably haven't got enough time for me to give you the whole pitch. But it's something that I'm really excited about. And as I say, it's like so many ideas. It just came about because at some point I found the word treatment quite interesting and wrote it down in a notebook 30 years ago, So, that's what treatment is about. And, again, if we get, as I expect we will, some strong interest in the IP, it may even become a comic book again. So we'll have to see.
So it is that football hooligan kind of?
No.
Oh, it has changed. It has changed.
Yeah, these are what you might call good guys, although then I'm not saying they necessarily are, but they're what you might call good guys.
Oh, okay. I like The Boys, like what Garth did with The Boys and everything. I can appreciate that.
Yeah.
Interesting. I look forward to it. I was gonna say I am sometimes fascinated by the British sports culture, and I'm not well, it's funny. I worked in sports for 16 years.
I know you did.
Oh yeah, I did sports radio for a long time, and American sports, but boxing in particular,
right,
was my background. But I have to, like every now and then, like Americans were really obsessed with bowling for several decades, and it was really a big deal here. And I love that in British sports culture, snooker became such a
yeah.
But I'll confess of current British sports that I love. I'm a huge darts fan. I love watching darts.
Oh, really?
I love the atmosphere, and I don't know if you've ever watched it.
Well, of course,
beyond the obvious in pubs and things, but
Well, snooker and darts, of course, have their origins in pubs, which is, given our climate, on most nights of the year, people are huddled in bars, So those sports come from there. Snooker is, and snooker, like, some other British sports, has an almost sort of Zen-like quality to it. It's very tactical. It's got rather a slow pace. Our other great sport is cricket, where games can run over many, many days. I used to share a studio with a friend of mine. I've never been particularly interested in sports, but I used to share a studio with a friend of mine who was obsessed with cricket, and he liked to listen to the cricket commentary on the radio. And, of course, it's just people slowly describing what's slowly happening. And of course, after every 6 balls, everybody sort of changes round because they're going to bowl the ball from the other end of the pitch.
Understood. Yes.
So it's got this rhythm to it. And the thing that I used to love, my favourite bit, was when the weather stopped play. So you then have this commentary box full of guys who had nothing to commentate on, but had to fill the air. I'm sure you're an expert at doing that, John, with you.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah. But these guys would have to fill a day's worth of dead air, and they would literally describe a bird that was sitting on a tree, or that it became this thing that people would send them in cakes. They'd send in cakes, and they described the cakes that they were eating, and reading out recipes and things. So English sports have always had that idiosyncratic thing, unlike American sports, which I think, particularly in the case of American football, is geared towards the TV and cramming in as many ads as possible. But
agreed.
Anyway, football, true football, British football, association or soccer football, was again a British sport and has its idiosyncrasies. But the thing with football was it got a really bad press in the 70s when it became more or less a vehicle for a lot of disaffected young men, often with rather right-wing views and certainly not a lot of love in their heart for their fellow man and woman. And what characterised football was the violence, both in the terraces, on the pitch, in the streets before and after the match. I mean, that has changed a lot now, again, for financial reasons, because there isn't enough money in entertaining drunken hooligans. You know, they want the families in there. They want people to buy seats and so on. So that's what's changed there. So treatment really springs from the golden age or the dark age of extreme football hooliganism. So that's the story on that.
Okay, fair enough. Now I just lost my train of thought of regard. I was going to say the cricket comparison to baseball has always been there, and it's so funny because as you explain what happens when there's a rain delay in cricket, we have that in baseball, and truly I feel the same way that like it's the best broadcasters. They don't talk about the birds out or cakes that they've been delivered. They usually go into old baseball stories, and it's just great. And I mean, you know, we years ago we had a great voice of Chicago baseball, and he was one of the best. Harry Carey, he was one of the best storytellers on those rain delays, and can just no problem. I got a million stories I could talk about, and it was as entertaining as the game was.
Well, you know, it's a really interesting thing, and I think I'm on the verge of developing a theory, even as we speak. That, you know, we were talking earlier about podcasts and radio broadcasts. And there is something about that as a medium. TV demands that it keeps people's attention all the time by constantly changing the picture, the scene, the soundtrack. You know, it's very fast moving. Like American football, it's very much structured around the needs of presenting it on TV. Whereas with podcasts, there is no particular time limit. And even the conversation we're having is rather a rambling inside baseball kind of thing itself. It's got a different tone, and I think there's a space for that. I think it's wonderful that spaces open up where people can talk at some length, develop ideas at some length, maybe even more interestingly than I'm doing at the moment. I'm sure that wouldn't be difficult. But you know, I think that's one of the interesting things, that as mass entertainment gets more fast-paced, there are spaces opening up, and there are enough interest in all sorts of obscure things that people can talk at some length, and without the need to think, oh my God, there's a news bulletin or a commercial coming up, you know. And I think it's the kind of entertainment that I certainly have got a place for in my life, and I would think I'm not the only one.
Well, you know, Dave, that's the ambition of what I try to do with my podcast, and I appreciate the people that are on that get it, so that's great to hear, and I hope I achieve, a level of entertainment with
you do, and I mean that it's always a pleasure to talk to somebody like you who has a deeper understanding and who knows how to put a show together, you know, rather than just, so Dave, what are you working on now? What was it like working with Alan Moore? You know, bang, 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 bang. So I do really appreciate that. I see we're now almost on the hour and a half mark. And I think I'm becoming a bit dry. Hopefully I've bugged your listeners and even you into insensibility. But before I go, the thing that I would really like to mention, and I have been teasing this for a while, it is a thing that actually really exists. I have written my autobiography. I'm going to have to update it because I actually finished writing it a year or more ago. But we now do have a publisher for that, it seems, and that's something that in the next year or so is really going to happen. And that is all the behind-the-scenes stuff that I can think of, all my anecdotes. It tells you what it's like working with Alan Moore. It tells you what it's like knowing Julie Schwartz and a lot of other things besides, because, you know, as I say, I am a fan, and as a fan, I have been lucky enough to get into comics at a time when I was able to meet many of the people that I revered as masters, and also to meet a lot of up-and-coming people, and also to have a lot of contemporary colleagues who I've shared many a drink and many a conversation with. So I think if you like comics, it's going to be quite an interesting read. If you're not interested in comics, I kind of think it might be quite interesting anyway, because I'm being as honest as I can about what it's actually like to be an insider. And it's going to be copiously illustrated with some stuff that people have seen before, but with a lot of, quite esoteric and unseen pieces of artwork that I've done over the years. And so I'm really looking forward to finally knocking that into shape. And hopefully I can come back to you, and it will have inspired some questions and some topics for discussion, and we can have another rambling conversation.
That would be great. I remember, and I was going to ask you off the air what the progress was for your autobiography,
right,
because you were kind enough about 5 years ago to tell me about it in New York,
and I
was thrilled then. And it was great. I hope this one story is in there, and I won't reveal it unless you want to. But I had just had Tony Hendra from This is Spinal Tap and all of his great comedy work with the National Lampoon Radio Hour and so many other wonderful things that he did. For people who don't know the name, he went to Cambridge a couple years behind the Pythons, a couple years younger, and had an incredible comedic career. And I guess you knew him as a young man, and it was thrilling to hear that story.
Well, I mean, it's weird how things join up. I mean, I think I probably won't tell the anecdote now, other than to say that if it hadn't been for Tony Hendra, the Bob Dylan song that inspired was one of the inspirations of Watchmen might not have hit me at such an early age. And my connection with Tony was that I went to school, the same school, with his younger brother Martin, who was one of my comics collecting buddies when I was at school, one of the few people in those far-off days who cared as much about American comics as I did. So knowing him was actually a very formative thing, but it is actually one of my prime anecdotes that I've honed into a wonderful, dramatic piece of writing and insightful piece of writing. But I think I will turn down your invitation to blunder through it now, and I'll leave it to your listener. If they haven't bought the book, I promise to read that anecdote from the book on your podcast when
very kind. Ooh, that's I like it, Dave. That would be great. So I certainly look forward to that. As always, Dave, I really appreciate this. You're right. It was kind of a rambling conversation. I was kind of hoping we'd do that, though, because after a couple, like you said, hey, what are you working on now? Like, let's sit back and really reflect, because I always say perspective. It's not wisdom, it's perspective. It's really just being around. And I mean, this is what happens with age in the positive way. Yeah. That we can kind of think about where things are going and where they've been, and be able to kind of, talk about it and stuff. So as always, great conversation.
Well, great. Well, I mean, always very happy to talk to you, John, and thanks for giving me the space to ramble and to explore some thoughts that I didn't know I had until I started speaking. And let's do it again when the autobiography's out, and we can have another fireside chat.
Truly one of the masters of comic book storytelling, Dave Gibbons, on today's Word Balloon. I hope you enjoyed it. You could tell from the smile on my voice, I enjoyed it, and I'm always happy to talk to Dave. And Dave's one of those guys that I always say, can't we all live on the same street? Wouldn't it be great? Although they'd probably run away from me if I lived on the same street as all of them as well. And that includes my Portland buddies as well. We're about a week away from C2E2, actually just under it, and looking forward to seeing everybody. I'm going to do 2 panels, one on Saturday with the great Sven Gulli, Rich Coase himself, the wonderful horror movie host that has become a national sensation. But, man, I'll tell you, I've known him since, or at least a fan of his, since I was a little kid back in 1979 watching him on the UHF channels. And I'm so happy that his career has expanded as it has. He is a big hero to Dan DiDio of DC Comics. Back in October, there was a wonderful Sven Gulli DC Universe kind of jam in the comic books, and we'll certainly talk about that at the panel. and just looking forward to giving fans a chance to ask Sven some great conversations and questions about horror movies, his show, and his sense of humor. One of the best. Also on Sunday, another two of my favorites, Jimmy Palmiotti and Amanda Connor on March 1st at C2E2. I'll be doing a spotlight panel with them. I love those guys. They're sweethearts. They are sweethearts, actually. As you know, they're now a married couple. They were a long time, couple that was together before they finally took the vows a few years ago. And they've delighted us together on great projects like Power Girl and Harley Quinn and so many other great books, and even their own separate work as well. God, Jimmy, I always like to point out one of the reasons why Marvel was able to get out of the depths of bankruptcy and become not only relevant, but evolved to where it is today. You got to hand it to Jimmy. He was part of Marvel Knights right there with Joe Quesada, helping, develop these books that became incredible films and television shows as well. So there's that. And of course, Amanda, my God. Where to begin? So many wonderful comics. Recent series that Amanda did outside of working with Jimmy was her take on the Before Watchmen series. We're talking to Dave, and she and Darwin Cook did a great Silk Spectre miniseries that looked into Silk Spectre's years in the 60s. Really, really great stuff. And, great writer, great artist, Amanda Connor. So it'll be a pleasure to talk to them on Sunday. Also, it's going to be a lot of fun at C2E2. All of the Kingsmen, as they're calling them collectively. It's Tom King, Mitch Gerrits, Clayman, Doc Shaner. They're all going to be at C2E2. Looking forward to seeing them there. And then, of course, I'll see them at Terrificon a few months later in the summertime. But I'll tell you, if you're in the tri-state area or thinking about a Chicago trip, C2E2 is going to be a blast. I look forward to seeing everybody and thanking them for listening to Word Balloon. So I hope I'll see you there. Word Balloon brought to you by the League of Word Balloon listeners via Patreon. Patreon.com/Word Balloon is the place to go if you want to subscribe to Word Balloon. Is Word Balloon worth $1 a month to you? Is it worth the price of a comic? If you think so, and you like what you hear and want to support the cause, that's where you go. Patreon.com/Word Balloon. Thank you, League of Word Balloon listeners. Word Balloon is also brought to you by Aftershock Comics. I'm really looking forward to Stephanie Phillips' new book that's coming out in just a couple of weeks, Artemis and the Assassins. She can join John Layman, who his brand new book, The Man Who Effed Up Time, is just hilarious. There's Zach Thompson's Undone by Blood and God Killers by Mark Sable, all on the way to go along with favorites like Animosity from Marguerite Bennett and things like A Walk Through Hell from Garth Ennis and Baby Teeth from Donnie Cates, Dark Red from Tim Seeley, Dark Ark from Cullen Bunn. Brian Azzarello has a great American Monster series at Aftershock. So many of my favorite writers and artists are at Aftershock doing incredible work, and they deserve your attention. Go to their website. You'll find full story descriptions, preview pages, and how to get these books digitally or through the diamond codes and order them through your local shop at AftershockComics.com. Thanks again for listening to Word Balloon. If you didn't catch it, I have a great conversation with Gene Colan from back in the day. A wonderful talk from 2005 because Word Balloon's 15th anniversary is coming up very fast. It'll be on May 10th, and I'll be occasionally looking back at the archive and bringing you some great old conversations as we get closer and closer to that 15th anniversary. Thanks for being on the journey with me. I really appreciate it, and more great new conversations on the way to wrap things up for February and into March. Until next time, Word Balloon is a copyright feature of Shaky Productions, copyright 2020.